All right, so let's do a review of our junctional rhythms. So in our junctional rhythms, our primary pacemaker site becomes the AV node. And so there are a few things that we get that are specific to junctional rhythms because of that. So as you can see in this diagram here, we get this electrical impulse that originates in the AV node, and it does travel down the bundle of His, then each bundle branch and out to the Purkinje fibers in the ventricles. But in order to get to the atria, we have this conduction called retrograde conduction that kind of travels backwards towards the SA node in order for the atria to contract. This can cause one of three things. First thing that it can cause is our inverted P waves, and that is represented by that backwards conduction from the AV node to the SA node. That backwards conduction can also cause an absence of P waves. And the reason being is that by the time the conduction reaches the SA node, the ventricles are already contracting, and the ventricles contracting have a higher electrical impulse. So the P wave just kind of gets buried in that QRS complex represented by the ventricles contracting, and we won't see it. The third thing that it could cause is a P wave following the QRS complex. And this is because the atria may not contract until after the ventricles have already contracted because of that backwards conduction. So those are the three things that kind of make our rhythm, that kind of stick out to us knowing that it's junctional. Now we need to decide what type of junctional rhythm it is, and that's going to be based on rate. So we know that the AV junction has a primary pacemaker capability of 40 to 60 beats per minute. So that is what our AV junction likes to beat at. So a junctional escape rhythm means that the primary pacemaker site has escaped to the AV junction, is a junctional rhythm that has, junctional rhythm that has a beats per minute of 40 to 60 beats per minute. So junctional escape rhythm means that our pacemaker has escaped to the AV junction and that it's performing within that normal intrinsic rate of that pacemaker site. Now, if it's slower than that, if it's slower than 40 beats per minute, we call that junctional bradycardia. Bradycardia meaning that it is slow for that pacemaker site. And it's below that normal intrinsic factor of the pacemaker site. So bradycardia in a junctional rhythm is going to be less than 40 beats per minute, whereas in a sinus rhythm it's less than 60 beats per minute. This just means that it's slower than the normal intrinsic rate of that pacemaker. The next rhythm that we have will be accelerated junctional rhythm. And this means that the heart rate is kind of above that normal intrinsic rate of the pacemaker. So it's going to be above 60, but it's also not quite going to be tachycardic. So it'll be below 100 beats per minute. So this just means that it is accelerated for this pacemaker site, but it's not quite tachycardia. We wouldn't quite call it tachycardia. And that leaves us with junctional tachycardia. Oops. Oh, having some trouble here. Sorry about that. And junctional tachycardia means that it is tachycardic, so the heart rate is going to be above 100 beats per minute, but the rhythm is coming from the AV junction, so it is junctional. So those are our different types of junctional rhythms. So let's take a look at our first one. This is a monitor printout, so I do have a pulse already there for me calculated. So it's 63 beats per minute. These QRSs here are as tall as the other ones. It just had some tape over it, so we couldn't really see it. So first thing I want to look at is it regular or irregular? Well, it is regular, so we'll make a note of that. The next thing that I'll want to look at is my P waves. So I do have one P wave for every QRS complex, and I'm going to highlight them here. You can see that my P waves are inverted. So these inverted P waves are one of the defining factors that we discussed up here that does make this rhythm junctional. So now that I know my rhythm is going to be junctional something. The next part we'll look at is our ST segment. So here's my ST segment, my J point, so where my QRS ends, going up into my T wave, and it seems to be right on that isoelectric line. So I don't have any ST segment deviation, so I don't need to add any ectopy. So let's go ahead and name this rhythm. So I know it's junctional, but I need to figure out what type of junctional. So going back here, I'm going to look at this heart rate. My heart rate is over that normal intrinsic rate of the AV node. So it's not junctional escape. Even though it's a little bit over, it is still over. So we're going to go into this accelerated junctional category because the heart rate's above 60, but it's less than 100. So I have accelerated junctional as my name at 63 beats per minute. I don't have any ST segment deviation, so I don't need to put any ectopy at the end. And I also don't have any, I only have one P wave for QRS complex, so I don't need to put a conduction ratio. All right, let's take a look at this next rhythm. So this next rhythm, it looks like I do have a heart rate. So my heart rate is only 38 beats per minute, which is pretty low. Looking at my rhythm, it looks regular until I get to this guy. And then everything else seems to march out regular. So it looks like I have an underlying rhythm here, and let's just take a look at that underlying rhythm. So I have a nice P wave, it's upright. I have a nice narrow QRS complex. I have one P wave for QRS, and my T wave looks normal. So this beat is a sinus beat along with this beat, because everything about it screams sinus. It's got a normal P wave, normal QRS complex, normal T wave, and over here, same thing. So I have sinus beats here. So my underlying rhythm is going to be sinus. Now I need to decide, is it sinus rhythm? Is it normal sinus rhythm? Is it sinus brady? Is it sinus tachycardia? Well, my heart rate's pretty low. It's only 38 beats per minute. So I'm going to go with sinus bradycardia. All right, but I still have to, and this is also sinus beat here, but I still have to address this guy. So I'm going to go for a different color for this complex. So if I look here, my P wave here is inverted, or it could be a dip in the T wave, or I might not have a P wave at all. But any of those things tells me that that's a junctional beat. So I'm going to put a J under it. My QRS is still narrow, which is also indicated, with a junctional rhythm, the QRS needs to be narrow. And my ST segment's normal, my T wave looks normal. But it is junctional, and the beat does seem to come early in the progression. So this is going to be a premature junctional contraction. So right with a P, J, C. So I have a sinus bradycardic rhythm at 38 beats per minute with a premature junctional contraction, and that is that beat right there. All right, moving down on the next one. So looking at this monitor printout, I have a pulse. Pulse is cut off here. Pulse that was detected by the blood pressure cuff was 52 beats per minute. So it's nice, that gives me a nice little readout. I don't have to figure out the rate. But let's look at each contraction here. So this first beat, I have a normal upright P wave, a narrow QRS, normal T wave, so that's a sinus beat. Then when I get further onto my next beat, I have an inverted P wave, narrow QRS, and that tells me that it's junctional. Looking at the third complex, I have no P wave, a narrow complex, so that's telling me again that it is junctional, because it does fit in one of those three things. And then when you look at this next beat, I start to get a little tiny P wave again. Very tiny, very short PR interval, but it's still there. I have a narrow QRS. So we'll probably guess that that beat's going to be sinus. And then looking on, I have an upright P wave, narrow QRS, normal T wave, sinus, upright P wave, narrow QRS, sinus, and then same with this last one. So I'm going from a sinus rhythm to a junctional rhythm, back to a sinus rhythm, and I can kind of see this progression by the changes in my P waves. So if this is my heart, and this is my SA node, whoops, doesn't like when I cut off the page. Let's redraw that, where we have some more room. I draw it on the other side here. So this is my heart, this is my SA node, this is my AV node, and what's happening to my primary pacemaker site is that it's kind of moving. So it starts off in this SA node with that first beat, and then it's starting to move towards the AV node, and that's where we get our next 2 beats. And then it starts moving back up towards the SA node, whereas we start to see that P waveform again, and it returns to the SA node. And this is further confirmed by, it looks like I have a slowation of my rate, because as it moves down to the AV junction, that pacemaker site's less or likely to slow down. And then as I move back up to my SA node, my rate kind of increases because the rate of my SA node is in fact faster. So there's 2 different ways we can label this. One, we can write it out. We can put sinus rhythm that converts into a junctional escape rhythm, because it is at 52 beats per minute, so that's the normal intrinsic rate of the junction. That converts back into a sinus rhythm. But that's a lot of wordage, and there's an easier way that we can label this. And we're just going to call this a wandering pacemaker. At 52 beats per minute. Because my pacemaker site is wandering. It's wandering between the SA node down to the AV node, and then back up towards the SA node. So that was a little bit of a tricky one. Let's look at some just regular junctional rhythms. So this next patient, we have a heart rate of 114 beats per minute. So already I'm thinking, well, that's tachycardic. It is over 100 beats per minute. Next thing I want to look at, is it regular or irregular? It does appear to be regular. And junctional rhythms typically are regular. And I say typically because there is that, 5 to 10% of cases where it's going to be slightly irregular. We still label it as a junctional rhythm, and we base it off of the rate that it's going at. Next, I'll look at my P waves. So I'm going to highlight my P waves here, and we can note that they are inverted. So instead of my P wave kind of having that upwards deflection, it's dipping down. So when I see those inverted P waves, I'm going to automatically be thinking junctional. I do have 1 P wave for every QRS complex. Next, I'll look at my QRS segment, very narrow, probably only 1 block. So it's telling me it is coming from above the ventricles. I don't have any wide QRS complexes. And then lastly, we'll look at my T wave. So there's where my QRS ends and where the ST segment goes into the T wave. So it looks like there is no ST deviation there, no ectopy. And the way we can draw our isoelectric line here is by going to the tops of the P waves. Just draw my line right through there. So we can see my T wave starts right on the isoelectric line, my ST segment, so there's no deviation or ectopy there. So now we need to label it. It is junctional, but what type of junctional? Is it going to be junctional bradycardia, junctional escape, accelerated junctional, or junctional tachycardia? Because it's over 100 beats per minute, we're going to group this into the junctional tachycardia category. So I have junctional tachycardia at 114 beats per minute. There's no ectopy, so I don't need to put any ST changes, and I don't need to put any conduction ratios because I only have 1 P wave per QRS segment. All right, let's take a look at the next one. So the next one, I'm going to have to figure out my rate on this one. It's not provided for me. So let's go ahead and look at one of these that starts nice on a line, and this last one does. I think I'll count between here. So I have 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29 blocks across. So 1500 divided by 29 gives me a rate of 51.7, so we'll call it 52 beats per minute. Next thing I want to look at is it regular or irregular, and it does appear to be regular. Oops. Sorry, I keep laying my hand on the board and it keeps bringing up my keyboard. Next thing I'll look at is my P waves. So there is a little bit of artifact in there. Patient may have a tremor, patient could be breathing. There's a piece of tape over this one so I can't really see it. But I can pick out my P waves, and I'm just kind of draw a line over that artifact, and you can still define that isoelectric line in that dip. So I do have inverted P waves, which does tell me that it is junctional. So I kind of make these little notes above the rhythm just to help me identify it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to go in my name. Next thing we'll look at is my QRS complex. Looks to be about two blocks, maybe 1.5, 2 blocks wide, so it is narrow. And so now let's go ahead and name it. So I know it's junctional because of the inverted P waves. I need to decide what type of junctional it is. I'm going to base it off the rate. It can't be junctional bradycardic because it's not lower than 40 beats per minute. So I'm going to label this junctional escape because it falls right in that normal intrinsic rate of the AV node. So this is a junctional escape rhythm. At 52 beats per minute. Now I don't have any ST changes, so this is the end of my QRS complex. And my isoelectric line is pretty easy to follow here because I got a nice slower rhythm. So we can see that even though my T waves may appear slightly peaked but not quite peaked because it's not really 2/3 of that QRS complex, look like they just might be a little tall. My ST segment is normal, so I don't need to put any ectopy at the end of that name. It's just going to be junctional escape rhythm at 52 beats per minute. All right, let's go ahead and look at the next one. So we do have a heart rate of 57 beats per minute. Now the monitor is telling me it's Brady. That doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to be Brady in my name though, so it's an important thing to note. Let's go ahead and take a look. Is it regular or irregular? Well, it looks to march out pretty regular. Let's take a look at my P waves. Well, it doesn't look like I have any P waves at all. Looks that that isoelectric line goes right into the QRS complex. So the absence of P waves does indicate to me that this is going to be a junctional rhythm. My QRS complexes look nice and narrow and normal. And my ST segment also looks normal, so there is where my QRS ends, and it goes up that isoelectric line into the T wave. So I have no ST segment deviation. So let's go ahead and name this. My heart rate is 57. That is in with the normal intrinsic rate of the AV node. So this is going to be a junctional escape, meaning that my pacemaker is escaped to the AV junction and it's beating at its normal rate. And this is going to be at 57 beats per minute. So a little bit different than the one above is that we don't have any P waves at all, whereas the one above we had an inverted P wave. All right, let's take a look at this. Next one seems a little bit interesting. So looks like I have this huge pause here, right? So I got this huge area where there's nothing going on, no heart rate or anything. So that's going to be a period of sinus arrest. So let's just go ahead and identify that because it's very long. It does stick out. This patient was actually only in their 30s and they came in for a syncopal episode. Turns out they had a syncopal episode because they were having these long periods of sinus arrest. Now when we do have a perfusing rhythm, it is a normal rate. So you can see here a rate of 76 beats per minute. I know it's really small. But let's just take a look at what kind of rhythm that we have. So first beat, I don't have any P wave. I have a narrow QRS, normal T wave, but the absence of P wave tells me that this is junctional. Looking at the next beat, no P wave, normal QRS, but the absence of the P wave tells me it is junctional, along with this next beat here, junctional. And then looking at this third beat, I do have a P wave, a narrow QRS, and a normal T wave, so this is sinus. So what happened with this patient is likely that they were in a sinus rhythm, and for whatever reason, their conduction rate slowed down. Maybe they had a wandering pacemaker site where it went down to the AV junction, or the AV junction might have started triggering to try to compensate for this sinus arrest. So we had a junctional beat here trying to compensate for the sinus arrest, and it failed, and we just had this long period of sinus arrest. And then all of a sudden the AV junction kind of triggered to start beating again because it senses that the heart's not beating, and it's kind of our fail-safe where we're going to start beating again. And that eventually did trigger this SA node to start beating, and it did continue on in a sinus rhythm after this. Now, this patient presented very, very stable. Their blood pressure was good. I think their blood pressure is actually listed up here, 131/74. They were pink, warm, and dry, and when they had this period of sinus arrest, they just got a little dizzy, felt a little chest pressure, and then when their heart started beating again, they felt completely normal. So it was a very interesting case. When it comes to labeling this rhythm, first of all, I would never give you a rhythm like this to label on a test, so no worries. I just thought it was interesting to look at. When I label this rhythm, I'd probably label this, junctional escape into a sinus arrest, back into a junctional escape rhythm. And because I don't really see the continuation on this strip, you could put, convert it into a sinus rhythm. So really you have 3 rhythms going on here. So it's very kind of complicated, but I just thought it was an interesting one to discuss. All right, let's look at our next one. Heart rate is 72 beats per minute. My rate is a little irregular, and that's because my rate changes. So my first rate, I have 2 different rhythms here. My first rate does look regular. And then I have kind of a break in between here, and I have another rhythm, which also does look regular. So this is an underlying regular rhythm. It just looks irregular because we have 2 different rhythms butting up against each other. So let's just look at the first one in the beginning. I have a nice P wave. I'm going to highlight all my P waves. They are all upright. I have 1 P wave for every QRS complex. And I have a nice narrow QRS complex. So this does tell me that this rhythm right here is going to be sinus. And we'll just keep it at a rate of 72 beats per minute because the blocks are kind of worn off and you can't measure it. So I have a sinus rhythm. There's definitely no ectopy. I don't have any ST segment changes. And then so we can label that one. Oops. Sinus rhythm at 72 beats per minute. And then looking at my second one, I have inverted P waves. So this is telling me the second one is junctional. I do have a narrow QRS complex, which is what I want to see, and I don't have any ST segment changes. It stays right on the isoelectric line. So since I can't count the rate on this one, we're just going to say that it's 72. I know that it's probably a little faster, but just because the blocks are disappeared, I can't really count it out. So if my rate's 72 beats per minute, I know it's junctional because of the inverted P waves. What am I going to label this? Well, it's not junctional escape because 72 beats per minute is over the normal intrinsic rate of the AV junction. So we're going to call this accelerated junctional. So I kind of have 2 rhythms here. I have a sinus rhythm at 72 beats per minute that converts into an accelerated junctional rhythm. All right, taking a look at the next one. My rate or my rhythm overall looks irregular, but really it's just these 2 beats that make it irregular. Everything else seems to march out pretty well or pretty close to being extremely regular. So my underlying rhythm is regular. I just have these 2 beats that kind of stick out that are kind of out of the pattern. So let's look at my underlying rhythm first. I have P waves, 1 P wave for every QRS complex. They are all upright. They all look the same. My pure interval is normal. So underlying is regular. P waves 1 to 1 and they're upright. My QRS complexes are nice and narrow. So far this underlying rhythm looks sinus to me. Looking at my ST segment, I have my J point where my QRS ends. Looks to be right on the isoelectric line. So there's no ST segment changes. So my underlying rhythm is going to be a sinus rhythm. I do need to figure out rate real quick. So I'm going to look at this first complex and second complex because that first one falls right on a line. So I have 5, 10, 15, 20, 21, 22. So 1500 divided by 22, that gives me a rate of 68 beats per minute. So I have a sinus rhythm at 68 beats per minute. And no ST segment changes, so I don't need to put anything about the ST segment, but I do need to note these two complexes here. And they do look a little bit different. So when I look at my P wave on these complexes, they're inverted, telling me that they're junctional. They also seem to come early in the progression, so I have a nice 72 beats per minute and then an early. Go back to nice 72 beats per minute and then, premature and early. So we're going to call this a premature junctional contraction, or a PJC. So I have a sinus rhythm at 68 beats per minute with PJCs. And what causes that is I just have some type of irritated spot in my ventricle, or not my ventricle, around my AV node that's kind of firing off early. All right, let's take a look at the next one. And we're going to go beat by beat here. So this looks like a sinus beat. The second one looks like a sinus beat. And I say that because I have a P wave that's upright. I have a narrow QRS complex, and I have a normal T wave. This also looks like a sinus beat and sinus beat. And then just looking at those first four complexes, my rate does look regular. So let's go ahead and count out rate. I'm going to use this complexes because they kind of end right on lines. So I've got 5, 10, 15, 20, 21, 22, 23. So 1500 divided by 23 gives me a rate of 65 beats per minute. And then when I look at this beat does look a little bit different. So I have no P wave. I do have a narrow QRS complex, and it comes early. So this is my PJC. Oh my goodness. This is my PJC. Premature because it does come early in the progression, and it doesn't have a P wave telling me that it's coming from the AV junction. So because that one came early, it takes a minute for my regular rate to pick back up. So I have a sinus beat. I have a nice P wave, a normal QRS. Same here. Looks like I'm back in my rhythm. And then when I look over here again, we have an early beat. No P wave. Oh my, I don't know what's going on with my keyboard there. An early P wave, no P wave, which tells me it's coming from the AV node, which means it's junctional, so it's my PJC again. And then when I look at my last complex, it appears to be sinus. So my underlying rhythm is sinus. I just have these two premature contractions that are coming from the AV node, so they're my PJCs. So my underlying rhythm is going to be a sinus rhythm at 65 beats per minute with PJCs. And then also note I don't have any ST segment deviation. If I drew my isoelectric line, my QRS ends right on that isoelectric line and then goes up into my T wave, meaning there's no ECTP there. All right, this next one, regular, irregular, well, definitely looks regular throughout. Let's take a look at my P waves. So I'm going to highlight my P waves here, and we note that they are inverted. So I have inverted P waves telling me it's going to be junctional. Looking at my QRS, nice and narrow there. Wow, really bad tracing, but nice and narrow there, which is normal, and which also, indicates junctional. Anything with a narrow QRS is either going to be sinus atrial or junctional. And let's figure out what my rate is. So we're going to look, we'll look over here because I didn't write all over it. So I have 5, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So I know that it's probably going to be over 100. I'm going to do 1500 divided by 14. Gives me a rate of 107. So I need to decide, is this junctional bradycardia? Well, definitely not. It's over 100 beats per minute. Is it junctional escape? No, because junctional escape would be between 40 and 60, or the normal intrinsic rate of the AV node. Is it accelerated junctional? Well, no, it's over 100 beats per minute. So it leaves us with junctional tachycardia. at 107 beats per minute. Do I have any ST segment changes in here? Well, let's go ahead. I'm going to erase all this stuff on here and let's draw my isoelectric line. So I'm just going to follow that baseline between the T wave and the P wave. And it looks like I have no ST elevation. So you can see my J point where my QRS ends is right on that isoelectric line. Then it goes up into my T wave. So it's just going to be junctional tachycardia at 107 beats per minute. All right, let's take a look at this next one. So right off the rip, I can tell that it is slow. So it is regular. But let's go ahead and figure out what our rate is. So I got 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 49, 50. So we'll do 1500 divided by 50 gives us a rate of 30 beats per minute. So very slow. Patient's probably very sick. Next thing I'm going to look at is my P waves. So I have either one or two things going on here. Well, it looks like I don't have any P waves at all, actually. It just kind of goes right into that QRS complex. So no P waves, which tells me that this is going to be junctional. All right, my QRS is nice and narrow. Looks like it's about 2 blocks wide, so 0.08 seconds. Now I just need to go ahead and label it. So I know it's junctional because I don't have any P waves and my QRS is narrow. It's important to note that junctional rhythms have to have that narrow QRS complex because it is coming from above the ventricles, and we'll learn more about that next week when we talk about ventricular rhythms. So is this junctional escape? So junctional escape would be between 40 and 60 beats per minute. So it's definitely below that. I got a really slow rhythm, so this is going to be junctional bradycardia. Because it is slow for the AV junction. Now I need to look at my ST segment. So we're going to look at this first beat here, and I'm going to draw that isoelectric line right across there, and it does look like I have a little bit of depression there. So we can note that in our name, and it's very minor depression. It's not any major depression, so if it's not, something we note, it's not a huge deal, but we do want to keep an eye on that. All right, next rhythm. So regular or irregular. It does appear to be regular. Let's go ahead and figure out what our rate is. So I'm going to pick this second complex because it ends right on a line, and my third complex also ends right on a line. So I'm going to measure from here to here just because it lines up really well. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35. So let's go ahead and pull up my calculator. 1500 divided by 35 gives me a rate of 42.8, so 43 beats per minute. Next, we're going to look at our P waves. Well, it doesn't look like I have any. Looks like that isoelectric line goes right into that QRS complex. So that tells me that this is going to be junctional. Also, it tells me that this is junctional is that I have a narrow QRS complex. So my QRS complex is only, well, if I'm looking at this one, about 2 blocks wide. All right, so let's go ahead and name this rhythm. So my rate is 43 beats per minute. I know that it's junctional because I get a narrow QRS and no P waves. So it's not junctional bradycardia because it's not slow for the AV junction. It actually falls 43 beats per minute, falls right in that normal intrinsic rate of the AV node. So this is just going to be a junctional escape rhythm. At 43 beats per minute. Now let's look at our ST segments. I'm going to draw my isoelectric line, which should be pretty easy on this one because I got a huge line to kind of trace. And where I look at my QRS ends, it does, that J point where the QRS end does end well above that isoelectric line. So we do have some ST elevation here. So we definitely want to make sure we note that because it is pretty pronounced ST elevation. So I got a junctional escape rhythm at 43 beats per minute with ST elevation. Definitely want to get a 12 lead on this patient to see where that MI is coming from. All right, last rhythm that we have here. So first of all, regular or irregular. Well, it does appear to be regular. Next, we need to figure out our rate. So I'm going to go, I don't really have any complexes that end right on a line, so I'll just go with the first one here. I got 5, 10, 15, 16, 17, 18, about 18 blocks in between. So I'm going to go ahead and figure out 1500 divided by 18 gives me 83 beats per minute. Next thing I'm going to look at is my P waves. So I'm going to highlight them for you. We have a very thick isoelectric line, but you see that dip right before the QRS complex. So those inverted P waves tell me that this is going to be junctional. Next, we'll look at my QRS complex. It's very narrow, probably only 1 block wide. Woo! Oh my goodness, I don't know what's going on here with my pen. I think I need a new battery. So we have a narrow QRS. So no P waves, or sorry, inverted P waves plus narrow QRS complex tells me that this is going to be junctional. So I just need to figure out what type of junctional it is. Well, it's not junctional escape because it's over the intrinsic rate of the AV node, which is 40 to 60. It's not quite tachycardic because it's not over 100 beats per minute. So it's going to be in that accelerated category. It's accelerated for the AV junction, but not quite tachycardic. So accelerated junctional rhythm. At 83 beats per minute. See if I have any ectopy. Just glancing at it, does not look like I have any, but I'll go ahead and trace my isoelectric line. And we can see our QRS ends right on that isoelectric line, and then we have a normal T wave. So there's no ectopy there. We're just going to call it an accelerated junctional rhythm at 83 beats per minute.